And at this time, I will now turn this webinar over to Adam or Richard for us to begin.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Richard Ruff. I'm a supervisor with the City of Chicago's Office of Labor Standards. Also with me is our Assistant Commissioner, Adam Weller. He will be handling any questions you have during the webinar. If you have any questions that come up, please place them in the Q&A box and he will be able to address them. Today's webinar is an overview of the Chicago's Minimum Wage Ordinance, including the annual increase, as well as the first step of the phase out of the tipped minimum wage credit. An outline of today's webinar, we'll go over the OLS overview and mission, some best practices, Chicago's Minimum Wage Ordinance, and then in addition to that, the youth workers and subsidized temporary youth employment programs. There are some key terms, the minimum wage increases, and an introduction into the tipped wage credit phase out. We will also cover the minimum or the wage theft ordinance, and then the OLS investigation and enforcement procedures. And then at the end of the webinar, we will have a question and answer section. So the Office of Labor Standards overview and mission. The Office of Labor Standards is dedicated to promoting and enforcing Chicago's labor laws. These labor laws include anti-retaliation, a domestic worker contract requirement, the Fair Work Week Ordinance, the Minimum Wage Ordinance, and then the new paid leave and paid sick and safe leave ordinance, as well as the wage theft ordinance. OLS seeks to engage communities to protect workers through a strong investigation and enforcement regime. OLS processes complaints, conducts investigations, mediates disputes, directs settlement proceedings, issues violations, and if necessary, we seek licensure discipline against employers who violate the ordinances. OLS also provides outreach and education to employers and workers to inform them of our practices. If you take a look at the stats on the right side of the slide, for last year, from January to December, we received over 600 labor standards complaints. We were able to close over 400 of them. And of those 400 that were closed, we were able to realize $430,000 in restitution that was paid directly to the workers. Some best practices. This presentation is intended to offer general guidance on the Chicago Minimum Wage Ordinance. The Office of Labor Standards cannot provide any legal advice. Should you have any questions, employers are instructed to consult their own legal counsel to determine any actions that they should or should not take to comply with the ordinance. So Chicago's Minimum Wage Ordinance, it's MCC 6-105-020. Beginning on July 1st, 2022, and every July 1st thereafter, the city's minimum hourly wage from the previous year increases in proportion to the increase, if any, of the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, provided, however, that if the CPI increases by more than 2.5% in any year, the city's minimum wage increase shall be capped at 2.5%, and there shall be no city minimum wage increase in any year when the unemployment rate in Chicago for the preceding year, as calculated by the Illinois Department of Employment Security, was equal to or greater than 8.5%. Any increase pursuant to the subsection shall be rounded up to the nearest multiple of 5 cents, and any increase pursuant to subsection 6-105-020B shall remain in effect until any subsequent adjustment is made. And now for the youth workers and subsidized temporary youth employment programs, beginning on July 1, 2025, The wage shall rise by the lesser of $1.50 or the wage set by subsection B1C. This increase shall occur every year until the wage is the same as the wage set by subsection B1C, after which the wage will continue being the same as for subsection B1C for the covered employees. So what is a youth worker? A youth worker is a covered employee who is under the age of 18 years old. And the subsidized temporary youth employment programs is any publicly subsidized summer or temporary youth employment program through which persons aged 24 or younger are employed by or engaged in employment coordinated by a nonprofit organization or governmental entity. Both of these definitions apply to individuals who are at least 16 years of age. Some key terms for the ordinances. The minimum wage ordinance covers any covered employee that performs at least 2 hours of work in any 2-week period in Chicago. A covered employee is any employee who, in any particular 2-week period, performs at least 2 hours of work for an employer while physically present within the geographic boundaries of the city. However, it does not cover any individual who works for an employer who has fewer than 4, so 1, 2, 3 employees, unless you are a domestic worker. A domestic worker is any person whose primary duties include housekeeping, house cleaning, home management, nanny services, including childcare and child monitoring, caregiving, personal care, home health services for elderly persons or persons with illnesses, injuries, or disabilities who require assistance in caring for themselves, laundering, cooking, companion services, chauffeuring, and any other household service to members of households or their guests in or about a private home or residence, or any other location where the domestic work is being performed. Some additional key terms: an employee is any individual, again, that performs work for an employer in the capacity of an employee as distinguished from a contractor determined pursuant to Internal Revenue Service guidelines. And an employer is any person who gainfully employs at least one employee for the purpose of counting covered employees for section 6-105020. The number of covered employees will be aggregated if they are employed by members of a single unitary business group as defined for Illinois income tax purposes. So in essence, this is, are you a W-2 employee or a 1099 independent contractor? And if you are a W-2 employee, it doesn't matter if you're full-time, part-time, temporary, seasonal, remote, or a domestic worker, you're still subject to the city's minimum wage ordinance. And then any employer could be a corporation, a sole proprietor, a partnership, not for profit, any of the city's sister agencies, which include Chicago Park District, Chicago Buildings Commission, or the Chicago Transit Authority. And then any domestic worker who has an employee. This is a snapshot of the part of the poster that is required to be posted for the current minimum wage. So as you can see, went into effect July 1st, 2024, and a standard employer, which is anyone with 4 or more employees. The minimum wage is now $16.20 for the year, and that will remain in effect until June 30th of 2025. The overtime minimum wage is now $24.30. And then the youth worker minimum wage is $15. Their overtime is $22.50. And then our tipped workers, the standard employer is $11.02 for their minimum wage with an overtime rate of $19.12. And the youth workers that are tipped is $10.20 or $17.70 for overtime. And then all domestic workers must receive at least $16.20 in a minimum wage, regardless if they are 1 or more than 4 employees or less than 4 employees. And then in addition, if anyone is using the tipped wage credit, and the tips wage does not, plus the tips does not meet the equal minimum wage, the employer must make up the difference. And this is a history for the minimum wage since 2020. And employers with fewer than 4 employees default to the state of Illinois minimum wage, which currently is $14 for 2024. And then if you notice in 2024, there is no differentiation between a large or small employer prior to in 23 and before. If you had 1 through 20 employees, you were considered a small employer. If you had 21 or more, you were considered a large employer and you were subject to different minimum wages. And then the Chicago's phase out of the tipped wage credit. The Chicago tipped wage credit beginning on July 1, 2024. Chicago will commence a 5-year phase out of its tipped wage credit. The tipped wage credit is 40% of the full Chicago minimum wage until June 30th, 2024. If the tipped wage plus tips does not equal the minimum wage, the employer must make up the difference. So the tipped wage credit phase out will proceed as follows. So in July 1 of 2024, the tipped wage credit was reduced from 40% of the minimum wage to 32%. And then again, in July 1st of 2025, the tipped wage credit will be reduced to 24% of the current Chicago minimum wage. In 26, it will be reduced to 16%. July 1st of 27, it will be reduced to 8%. And then July 1st of 2028, no tipped credit will exist and tipped workers will make the full Chicago minimum wage at that time. And then this is the OLS required posting. Employers must post this informational poster at their place of business, if applicable. In addition, it must be provided to each covered employee on an annual basis. And the information is updated by the Office of Labor Standards every July 1st. So this has the information on the minimum wage theft, human trafficking, how to file a complaint. And it also has the information regarding the new paid leave and paid sick and safe leave ordinance. The Chicago's wage theft ordinance. Salary means compensation owed to an employee by reason of employment. So the wage theft ordinance follows under 6-100-050A, an employer who fails to timely pay a worker in accordance with this Article 2 of Title 6 or in accordance with any wage agreement between the employer and the worker above the threshold required by this Article 2 shall have committed wage theft. Wage theft includes the non-payment of any wages required for work performed and also includes not granting or properly paying required paid time off, whether legislatively or contractually required, and contractually required benefits to the worker. It also includes the timely payment of wages shall be in accordance with Illinois state law 820 ILCS 115-4. And then a worker may file a claim with the Office of Labor Standards or in a civil action, but not both. That means you can either file a complaint with us and we can seek to get you your wages back, or you can privately file an action in court and go that way, but you cannot do both. Covered employee who files a claim with Illinois Department of Labor may also not file with the Office of Labor Standards unless the Illinois Department of Labor has referred the case to our office. An employer shall be liable to the covered employee for the amount of any underpayments and also liable for damages of either 2% of any such underpayments for each month following the date of payment when such underpayments remain unpaid, or 2, the amount specified by the Illinois Wage Payment and Collection Act 820 ILCS 115-14A if the amount in the state law is greater. So what is wage theft? Wage theft is the failure to pay workers the full wages to which they are legally entitled. Wage theft can take many forms, including but not limited to minimum wage violations, which are paying workers less than the legal minimum wage, any overtime violations, which constitutes failing to pay non-exempt employees time and a half for hours worked in excess of 40 hours per week. There's also off the clock violations, which are asking your employees to work off the clock either before or after their shift. And there's meal break violations, which is denying workers their legal meal breaks. And then if you have any pay stub or illegal deductions, taking illegal deductions from wages or not distributing them their pay stubs. So as the tip minimum wage violations, confiscating tips from the workers, all tips belong to the employees and not the business, or failing to pay the tip workers the difference between their tips and the legal minimum wage. So that's if the tips and their tipped hourly wage don't equal the city's minimum wage, they have to legally make up the difference. Employee misclassification violations. You can misclassify employees as independent contractors to pay a wage lower than the legal minimum. So if you're just paying somebody a flat rate and they should be classified as an hourly employee and they're not getting their, overtime if they work more than 40 hours or whatever their flat rate is wouldn't equal to the city's minimum wage times the amount of hours that they actually worked for that week. And then the anti-retaliation section for the minimum wage ordinance. So retaliation is prohibited, and it shall be unlawful for any employer to discriminate in any manner or take any adverse action against any covered employee in retaliation for exercising any right under this chapter, including but not limited to disclosing, reporting, or testifying about any violation of this chapter or regulations promulgated thereunder. For purpose of this section, prohibited adverse actions include, but are not limited to, unjustified termination, unjustified denial of promotion, unjustified negative evaluations, punitive schedule changes, punitive decreases in the desirability of work assignments, and other acts of harassment shown to be linked to such exercise of their rights. An employer shall not use its absence control policy to count paid sick leave as an absence that triggers discipline, discharge, demotion, suspension, or any other adverse activity as well. This is a screenshot of the OLS website. The OLS website is a valuable resource tool for employees and employers alike. As you can see, each ordinance under our jurisdiction has its own section and click box, with each subsection containing information on the ordinance, applicable rules pertaining to the ordinance, and FAQ documents. The information on the OLS website is available in the top 12 languages spoken in the city of Chicago. And the web address is chicago.gov/labor standards. Some additional screenshots of our website. So we've also developed a section on there that has new educational resources for every Chicago labor law. And these are two examples of the fact sheets and informational sheets for minimum wage and wage theft. And OLS complaints and investigations. Complaints can be submitted via online or mail or by calling 311 or using the CHI 311 app. There are also resources available to assist you with filing complaints on the OLS website. Once a complaint is received, the OLS will review the complaint and contact the complainants. And then during the investigation, OLS will subpoena necessary records from the employer to help facilitate the outcome of the investigation. And then we will conduct a settlement with the employer. And then if necessary, any citations, mail license, discipline, or circuit courts will be filed for the employer. And then the OLS webinars that are on YouTube, the BACP YouTube page, it's youtube.chicago/ChicagoBACP, contains recordings of 56 webinars that the OLS has hosted throughout the years. Many of these webinars are available in Spanish along with their English version. And this is the contact information for our department, phone number, our email directly to the labor standards, or you can email the BACP outreach, which will get forwarded to us as well. And then our mailing address at 2350 West Ogden. And that is the end of the webinar. I will leave this up here if there are any questions that anyone has.
Please put your questions in the chat box. Richard, it doesn't look like we have any questions. I just thank you.
Let's see. Yeah, yes, we can email you a copy of the slide deck. If you just email the labor standards email, it will be sent to you in a PDF form. But yeah, looks like we don't have any questions. Is there any exemption to the minimum wage? So the only exemption would be if you're an employer with less than 4 employees, you would default to the state's minimum wage, which is currently $15 an hour. What is the airport's minimum wage? Well, the airport is located within the city of Chicago, so as long as the employer, you're working for the actual airport, it should be at least 1620. Or if one of the like outlets, as long as there's more than 4 employees, 1620. However, if you're subject to a collective bargaining agreement, most likely will be whatever is outlined in your CBA. If the owners are paid through payroll, then they are considered employees, most likely. But that would take some additional research to determine. So doing the physical work in Chicago versus a remote worker. So you can be both. So if you're doing physical work like at an office or work site, if that location is physically in the city of Chicago, you're subject to the city's minimum wage. And if you're a remote worker working from home, as long as their home is within the city limits of Chicago. If they're in the suburbs like Niles or whatever, they're not subject to the remote work. They would not be subject to the city's minimum wage. They would be subject to whatever locale they're in right there, most likely the Cook counties.
We still have time for a few more questions. Please put your questions in the chat box. Okay, Richard, if you're okay with it, I say we can go ahead and end today's webinar. Doesn't look like we have any more questions.
All right, that works for me.
If you are a part of the BACP Entrepreneur Certificate Program, your digital webinar card will automatically update within 24 hours. In order to earn a certificate, you must enroll in the program. Registering for webinars does not automatically qualify you for a certificate alone. Thank you for today's presentation, Richard, and everyone continue to have a great day and go vote.
Thank you all. Have a good one.